Today's guest on the Keenan Yoga podcast is Edward Clark. Edward Clark is most known for his performing company Tripsichore, who have produced yoga theatre pieces for around the last 20 years. Based in London, UK, they've toured all over the world and have branches all over the world. Edward started the practice of yoga in his native Canada in 1978 or thereabouts, while studying performing arts, I think mainly dance. A most accomplished practitioner himself, he's also really a thinker of great note, which I think really comes across in this interview, inquires, thinks, and comes up with new perspectives. So in it, we'll primarily talk about the practical use of yoga in the world, as opposed to as a private endeavour for oneself alone. So instead, his intention with Tripsichore is really to connect outwards the individual into the world, rather than as an exclusively individual-centred endeavour. So the practical usage, done in sharing yoga theatre with people, as well as the performers in putting their own yoga to the test. It's a test on stage of yoga, which is interesting in our discussion. So the aim is embodiment, and not in a transcendental way, but in the continuity of a flowing waters of identity, like life itself. This is related to his use of vinyasa as representative of a state of being, not rigidly unified in stasis, asana, but ever-changing, ever seeking balance. It sounds complicated, but we'll discuss this further. I hope you enjoy the conversation. We had 2 attempts because the best expression of our conversation and converging ideas was not really easy to get down exactly. Even this time, I always try to work on a real discussion and not simply biographies. So we pushed through and ended with something quite interesting, I think. Anyway, remember, if you like the podcast, you can donate via our website, keenanyoga.com, as it does take a lot of time and effort. Also, feel free to review us at any point and mention your interest in any guests you might want interviewed. I'll leave you here now to listen to it. Right, so second time round, welcome Edward from Tripsichore. Is that right?
That's right. That absolutely. It's like you've been saying it all your life. It's like you're a Tripsichorean.
I've been practicing. It doesn't come naturally, but Tripsichore. Okay, it's what we thought in Ashtanga terms as the devil, a kind of vinyasa-esque, somewhat Ashtanga based performative yoga, I think, which is leading to my first question. What is it? Is it a performance? Is it yoga? What were your intentions behind what you started there?
That's got things off to a great start. I think we'll be able to cut those first 3 syllables. It's a Tripsichore is a performing company, and we do something called yoga theatre. So we practice yoga technique, and as such, we've looked at the similarities between yoga, theatre, and dance too, music as well, and look upon them
as... Is it a practice, I suppose? I was reflecting, because we talked a lot before. Eda and I have already talked a little bit, quite a lot in fact, and I was trying to get a handle on it, and what was coming to my mind is it a practice in itself, or do you do another practice and that's something... Is it a dance performance? I was hesitant to call it a dance performance, but I don't think you think of it that way. It's a lot more than that, as we will discuss.
Well, we never call it dance. We call it theatre, or I do anyway. I think anybody, if you took most of the people who are in or have been in Tripsichore and tried to teach them dance steps, most of them would sort of exhibit smoking synapses, because it's quite different. I'm highly biased here, but I would say, in terms of a yoga technique, I really think it's extremely advanced and complicated and well thought through. But its point is that a practice is different than something that is an end in itself. We one uses yoga as a technology for deciphering who the self is and what the nature of reality is. And that I think this is what one does with art as well, that the art and yoga are these technologies for understanding self and apprising reality. And as such, I think they are both aesthetic philosophies. They use the senses to come to an appreciation of beauty, and that's what they're about. That's what Tripsichore is, but we use it to do something rather than we lock ourselves up for 2 hours every day and that's the practice, and it's unrelated to what goes on outside. It's intimately related with what goes on outside. So I think what's happened in the yoga world that is quite unusual. It's as though you have, I think maybe I talked about this last time, so I'm hoping I sort of recover it well. If you had the things that were called dance classes, and dance classes, whether it was contemporary or ballet or whatever, but that was what you did and you called that your practice, but there was no such thing as performative dance, as in a theater performance of dance, or even going out to dance with people at night because you'd studied some kind of social dancing. That you just had the practicing of dance in a studio with no application to it outside. That's somewhat where we're at with yoga at the moment. The actual physical skills, some of which are quite remarkable, have very little application in the real world, and it's curious that people enjoy it as much as they do without having gone further into what it's the point of doing it actually is, and the rationales that are made for why it makes them feel better or why it's healthy, or they strike me personally as curious, but then again, they don't have to strike me as being something that's worthwhile. It's up to people use it for what they use it for. But the point of Tripsichore is that it has direct application.
I think so. I mean, what came to my mind before, and it struck me in talking to you the last time we chatted about the idea of needing to have a test in yoga, right? That it's all well and good what you do in your bedroom, but how does that practically apply when your skills are put to the test in the performance of what you're doing? And then it kind of made me kind of think, well, at what point did you kind of feel? I mean, it strikes me that your application of yoga is quite practically applying the self in the world, as to how can the self be applied in the world. So it's definitely, or correct me if I'm wrong, appears a more of an immanent, let's say, rather than a transcendent view of yoga, right? Like in the idea of being tested and putting yourself to the test and facing up to those fears, perhaps, and applying yourself in the context of other people and relating to other people in your yoga practice, rather than just, it being something that you did exclusively for yourself, for something other than inserting the self in society. Does that make any sense?
There's so many ideas in that. Now, here's an interesting thing, and this, I think, is a real yogic test. If you're on stage and you've got choreography that's meant to happen to certain places in the music where you're relating to the music and you're trying to convey character or narrative or even just a lyrical idea to the audience, and something goes wrong. If you fail the test, you sort of go, whoops, oh my gosh, that was no good. But the people who pass the test are the ones who have the yogic wherewithal to carry on and fold the whole thing back into the fact that, yeah, this was meant to be a very organized thing that happens on certain beats. We know how it's supposed to go, but I actually fell over out of that handstand. And we have to somehow, in real time, make it all hang together again. That's the real test. The people who can have it go completely wrong and they retain an evenness of mind. So they're
yeah. I was reticent about the idea last time, but now I kind of see it. No, I kind of see it a lot more clearly in a way, because a lot of the time there's a lot of fear and judgment when we're on the mat alone, but it never really comes to fruition, right? Right, in terms of inserting, like you feel the fear coming up to a handstand yourself, but you never really kind of go through that and fall over in front of a bunch of people. I can see how it would work, right? And make it good and accept it, and and you kind of pass through it in a way. It adds another level to the whole thing. Let's say.
Well, you know what it reminds me of, just what I was thinking while you were talking there, is when the teacher singles out a student and they fall apart because the teacher's watching them. And you go like, why would you do it worse just because the teacher is watching? They actually aren't, in fact, touching you, but you're allowing whatever the relationship is to spoil your work. And it's the same. Oh my gosh, I'm in a theater and it's too cold. Or what's another way of putting this? If you were outside and you're going, wow, I'm doing an outdoor practice, man, this is so fabulous. And then a cloud passes in front of the sun and it ruins everything for you. That wouldn't really make sense. And this is the study of self is going like, okay, I can see what I have to do so that I don't ruin everything in terms of what I'm actually creating. And I think, you're using the idea of immanence and transcendence to suggest that the creative thing is somehow, but that's the transcendent thing, is where you take something that was only existed in your mind and you make it real. It becomes an actual thing. And this, I would say, is the larger practice of what Tripsichore is that we assemble over a lengthy period of time a narrative that has various characters and pulls together costumes, music, production, and we take something that did not exist and we give it form, and we use that to communicate to others. Whether the communication is a direct understanding is highly debatable, but it is something that, when watched, does have a particular effect. So what we see in theatrical performances, normal theater performances, is you have an actor playing a sad scene, and so the audience, even if their lives are not sad, if they're doing it convincingly, they become sad too. So if you're doing a validly, now this is open to a lot of interpretation, but if the performance that you give is yogically truthful, the audience should have a yogic experience, some kind of meditative experience. Presumably, as we do choreograph it down to each breath, the people watching will be breathing and having a similar breath to what the people are doing on stage. So just like when you watch a dancer take a great leap across the stage and you thrill a little bit inside, some some part of your spine kind of goes with that. You take a deep breath in with them. The thing that's happening to the people in a yoga theater piece is something that then transcendently passes to the members of the audience. In that sense, it is a practice where the self is brought into an interface with that which appears to be other.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's very much the view of the self here in yoga is very much contextualized with others, right? I mean, that's the way that you're bringing yoga into this space, right? So it's not something which you do exclusively for your own self-awareness in a void as such. You know, the meaning of the self being exclusive to one's internal kind of pratyaharic withdrawal. It's very much inserting the meaning of self within the context of the other and in society. And also fairly practically speaking, right? Like what you're talking about in terms of interfacing with the audience and, attempting to make good, potential failures and, in front of other people, which is probably our biggest fear, is practically a very, very effective use of yoga, I would say.
Sorry. I'm assembling this out of every third word.
Yes,
Gosh, Adam. Okay, well, one of the notions that seems to inform much of yoga practice for the last 100 years, as far as, which is what we have maybe the best handle on, is the idea that there is a foundational self, and that the study of that foundational self, which is something eternal, unchanging, everlasting, and is in some way identical to the nature of the universe, hence Atman equals Brahman. In feeling that the one can make this connection with others in a theatrical kind of way, it is a way of perhaps accessing that idea of there is what is there is the same in all things, and its everlastingness would be the fact that this I or consciousness being present in all things does not rely on my individual life, that when I die, that I will still persist in all things, that it somehow is the root or foundation of, that's, I guess, the sense in which I'm thinking.
I think it ties in with your idea of static and active asana, right? So, and you have something very interesting to say about uses of the static as opposed to like the vinyasa, right? And what they mean in terms of a sense of self in time or in flow.
Yes. Well, one looks inwardly and one's looking outwardly, and the inward-looking one, to my mind, suggests a negating of embodiment in a bodily process, and it's always going to have a certain difficulties. The idea that you can bring the body to a place of stillness and the mind to a place of stillness and the breath to a place of stillness is seemingly contradicted easily. The yogi might appear to be seated without moving, but in fact blood is still coursing through their veins and their endocrine system is still pumping out glandularly, and they're seated on a planet that is spinning around, and the planet itself is circling the sun, and the sun is caught up in a galaxy that is also in a large galactic whirl, and it's part of an expanding universe. And then one can try and overcome this apparent ceaseless change by doing a negation of it, but it seems doomed to fail. However, that said, whatever the premises of this outward idea, which I would call the vinyasa idea, I mean, its premises are equally ridiculous. That it attempts to assemble a simulacrum of what the rest of the world or universe is doing by accessing it sensually. So it's taking electrochemical symbols that get delivered either through touch or smell or hearing or visuals or taste, and delivered to various parts of the brain, and images are created in the brain from these electrochemical symbols that represent what it is interpreting from what's going on in the real world, but that still would be considered Maya, an illusion. But I think the thing is, one recognizes that this illusion is a highly creative enterprise. It's not something that you necessarily believe in because it's so changeable. It's not something that is fixed. And I mean, it's an interesting tension between these two. The idea that the asana approach, the static, as you're saying it, attempts to find its understanding through stillness. And the other one, the vinyasa approach, is the activity one, tries to approach it through the understanding of continuous change. And undoubtedly, both of them are valid and right, and neither of them is right. It's a fascinating tension between the two that is never going to be wholly resolved. So what one does in a yoga practice, or what I think one does in a theater performance, is you hypothesize breath by breath. You're going, okay, with this breath, my inhalation is going to take me what happens? And that's the vinyasa sort of thing. What's happening here? What am I interpreting? And what am I contributing to it? I would say maybe it's just a small caveat, and I can certainly argue against this position as well, that it's involved in this reciprocity, whereas the static one seems to be purely a receiver. It envisages, I guess, this foundational self as something that it merely observes and isn't engaged as a part of this and has stepped back and away from it, which is a fascinating hypothesis. How does one test it? One tests it by doing a practice. At the end of the practice, though, you still are going to have to step off your mat, step out of the studio, and go and do something. Where does that leave you? Does it give you delight?
Yeah. I think your work definitely tests the tensions of the ego or the relationship between the ego. I mean, it's a very embodied sense of yoga. I suppose that your critics would say, well, embodiment in a world of, as you put it, maya, of illusion is just playing with falsity. But how would you come back from that?
Well, yes, of course it's false. It's imaginative. Nobody looks at a painting of a landscape and thinks, that's a landscape. No, it's paint on canvas. Yeah, anybody who thinks that their version of reality is actual, it would be crazy. But it's creative. It's a delight to make it up. It's how we live our lives. And we're not condemned to just one version of it. We can go and, the next breath is something different. To invest in the idea of a self that is unchanging because it's the true one would be equally foolish. How can a finite creature actually understand infinity? We're at best trying out a theory and using a method and techniques to try and give it form, and then we try again on the next breath.
How do you recommend the members of your company to practice on their own to balance this? I mean, because obviously there's this one aspect of performative and interacting with others and the audience and embodying in a creative sense one's life force. And there's another tension that we've discussed, which is, looking at ego, in terms of one's own self, perhaps in a different manner. Do you ask the troupe, the other performers, to have a different kind of practice outside the performative one? How do you guide that?
Well, the people who are in Tripsichore, we occasionally have people who've only done yoga as a physical discipline. We seem to get a lot of actors. Occasionally there's dancers. But whatever their practice is, they really, even people with a seriously advanced dance practice, it seems to take about 18 months for them to be able to come to grips with what this kind of a practice is. It's different. It takes a while to figure it out. No one just steps right into it and is able to do it. But it doesn't seem to much matter where they're coming from, as long as there's a certain physical capacity. I do like unusual shapes. Bodies that are not necessarily what one would go, oh, well, that's a dancer, that's an acrobat, or that's an actor.
Yeah, we talked a little bit last time about the possible charges of elitism on this, right? That in order to perform, you have to have a certain kind of ability and ableism in body. And actually, you were eloquent in saying that you rather favour people who have different kinds of bodies, right?
Yeah, I'm very interested in daring. That's why I was excited when you were saying you had in your 20s you had an abusive relationship with substances, because I think usually the people who get good at yoga have not usually, often have had a sense of risk, a desire to alter their consciousness, or to recognize that altering of consciousness is something that facilitates a deeper understanding of who they are and what reality is. But they also are smart enough to realize that they don't need substances to do it. Like once you've realized what the substances do, you probably can figure out a way to do it without sort of. But to know that the territory is there where extremity and intensity exist, I think that's very important to somebody who's going to do Tripsichore, even if they're not abundant, apparently so in their real lives. They tend to be intellectual risk takers, or they're imaginative risk takers. Sometimes they're emotional risk takers, they're intellectual risk takers, or they're physical risk takers, and they use this as a way, as a form of stimulus to facilitate a deeper understanding of themselves and a deeper understanding of reality. And the fact that they recognize the likelihood of consciousness altering and it being a desirable thing makes them good at yoga and makes them, I would say, good philosophers.
And how does that play out in terms of the audience? I mean, what's your objective to the show in terms of, is it just to allow people to see things from, in terms of the audience from different angles, or have you got a particular objective towards informing or educating the audience?
It's like having an energy bath. It should be entertaining, and it should be stimulating. They should be taken on a yogic journey, but there's no message, nothing like that. It's unless it's the substance of what we've just been talking about here, that take risks. How far can you go? Live this. This is what it feels like to put your leg behind your head, or try and balance on one arm or one leg. This is get out there, experience, and we're all in this together. But we're not all the same.
So you don't put it together a particular show with a certain type of message in mind, or is there? I mean, I've seen some of the shows you shared with me. They do seem to be around certain kind of feelings, right?
Death. They're always about death. Well, perhaps they're. Trying to think. They certainly involve spiritual frustration. People who are not spiritually accomplished, the things that happen to them, there's certainly characters that are always in it. I think but I do think there's also, where I'm interested in what happens post-death. So, I don't know, shows. We did one called The Last Breath, where, sort of was a 45-minute show where the last breath was dissected down into this person on a hospital bed and what they were going through in that last breath. Or we had another one called Beyond Death, The Essential Remains, which we... we did one about vaguely based kind of on the life of Rajneesh. Somebody who's flawed, but who's also quite accomplished. And what happens to them? What are the things that save them? How do they live with themselves? The last show that we were doing was called Release from the Cage, and it's you're always trying to figure out some reason why people are doing yoga on stage, and in that one, this guy's a prisoner. He's in solitary confinement, and he's trying to keep his sanity by doing yoga, and of course, not entirely succeeding at it. It's difficult. If he entirely succeeded at it, the show would be over. But the object in the end is he realizes that the door to his cell wasn't even locked. He just had to go and open the door. Oh, who would have seen that coming?
Well, yes. Isn't that so often the case? Are you trying to convince people to do yoga, or is it purely vicarious, just a spectacle for them?
Oh,
or is there any kind of proselytizing here? In terms of
not unless we're selling a workshop that's the next day.
Yes, I didn't imagine that would be that kind of lowbrow aim would be yours, Edward. But what about? Okay, let's try another a tangent. And this is kind of going the other way around to the normal interviews. What was your background in yoga practice, your own background, just for the audience now, and what made you get into this in terms of, was this your original objective for yoga, and what are the objectives to your own personal practice? I'm assuming you do one now.
Wow, those are two big questions. It was very shortly after I started studying dance. It's in 1978. The woman that I was studying with fancied this boy in the class who had done something called Iyengar or something like that, yoga. And anyway, so all of a sudden Tommy was, now Tommy's going to teach us some yoga. And so Tommy was like, oh man, this is hippie bullshit. I was like, because it was 1978, you know, and I had a punk haircut, and it was like, so anyway, much as I resented Tommy, this Iyengar yoga, which couldn't have, it was a little Iyengar I see now. It was really interesting. It just doing it, like we're going, oh my God, this is really cool. So just started taking that stuff and doing it at home and messing around with it. I'm such an autodidact. Mm-hmm.
What did you like about that as in comparison to the dance? Because you're already proficient in dance. So what did you find that was lacking? What to take off?
I wasn't proficient in dance. That was the thing. It made me so much better at dance. That was, I think, what was it. It just was.
So was it just a practical interest that you had towards it?
It was. It felt very deep.
Deeper than dance?
A different kind of depth. It was more like the bass notes. And anyway, so we did, we used this for years, and we had a joke that we were going to do something called yoga theater, which we would do. It was going to be so boring that the Arts Council would love it. They were sure to fund it, because they were like funding, at least this was our opinion at the time, was, like the things that they were funding were like so off-putting and going like, oh my God, they managed to destroy contemporary dance in this country. What looked like in the late 70s.
Was that in Canada or were you in England then?
Both, actually.
I could imagine something the Arts Council would be in favour of in the UK.
Yeah, nothing moving. However, that never panned out. But we got to this place where we were ready to do a new project. We just finished doing something called Revenge of the Love Cannibals, and we were looking for a new project. Let's just mess around with that yoga theater idea, because we're trying different styles and taking the piss out of Cunningham technique and ballet and stuff. And then we went, okay, yeah, we're going to put two sun salutes together, so close together that they're going to run into each other, and they'll just have to. We started doing this, and it just immediately began to generate really good material, and we jettisoned everything else and went, okay, yeah, let's do this other thing. And we started work. We did sort of an adaptation of first few chapters of a Ben Okri novel. Well, that was our starting point. We went, okay, yeah, this could be this. So it sort of came from there. We just. The amazing thing about it was that it was instantly so much better than everything else that we'd been doing. I mean, it was embarrassing, and that and so stimulating, because it was like you had all this material that was already about huge subjects like mysticism and ecstasy and balance and harmony and equilibrium, and it all went together. It was really, really exciting to do. It took us forever to get any really good at it, but it was that's how that started. And second half of your question. These days, I try and pretend that I'm 25, not in the abusing substance kind of way like yourself, but no, I'm still trying to have a very difficult, demanding practice. For the pandemic, there's been so little teaching.
For the sake of the performance or for the sake of something else?
That's really an interesting question because, I'm keeping up the performance material as best I can, but I think it's also shamefully there's a certain amount of vanity in it that it's to try and hold back the inevitable deterioration of, because try as I am to be 25, I'm probably better than I was at 25, but I'm not as good as I was 10 years ago, say, or, there is the sad secret of aging is actually happening, and try as I am to hold back the sands of time and King Canute the waves of elderliness coming on. So yeah, the futile attempt to stay young forever. That's a joke.
But I understand it's a joke, but wouldn't the contextualizing of your practice in and amongst other people also somehow dissipate that? I can see how, actually, although you put to the test, and I really like that idea of the yoga test.
It's like you're one tries to be a sculptor and the sculpture. That's how I see it, a living sculpture, that you're dedicated as an artist to making beauty. And I don't mean it just like in a classical statue kind of. It's this idea that beauty is inherent in all things, but we need technologies like art or yoga to reveal it to us. And that's, for me, that's the thrilling thing about it, is I try to make something that I feel is beautiful, and it has to work on so many levels, and one is constantly refining it, whether it be the line or the way in which you use your focus or the narrative that you're trying to put across, or just whether it's to achieve a certain pureness of balance and harmony of limbs. It all comes together in something that constantly evolves and which allows me to experience beauty in myself and also to appreciate it in others and the circumstances of all things, where, there's many things that are apparently not beautiful. So to have a technology through which one accesses what is aesthetic in all circumstances seems to me to be that to me is the great unifier of yoga. And maybe that's Tripsichore's thing. It's that there is beauty to be accessed in all times, in all places, but it's not necessarily obvious to us because we're finite creatures trying to deal with the infinite. And that, for me, gets me around the earlier problems of talking about the idea of a foundational self, and does that really exist? It's rather the foundation is that the universe is amazing, reality is amazing, but we're not likely to see it all the time. It takes huge discipline to keep coming up, to see it in yourself, to see it in reality, to see it in everything that appears to be other. This is what I see art and yoga doing.
That's excellent. Yeah, I think we finally got there.
That's such a good final line.
Oh, well, it was good. It was good. All right, let's leave it there.
Thank goodness. Can we cut like about 40 minutes of this and just get to that last bit?
No, that was a good. You got there in the end. You know, I think what you're doing is excellent. Just to round out a picture of you for the audience. Look, give me one, and don't think too hard on this. For God's sakes, you think way too hard. Is it one inspiration and one guilty pleasure?
God.
An inspiration or guilty pleasure, both two things. So, inspiration, something that inspires you, a place, a book, a person. A piece of art, and something you take pleasure in. You know, something anything. just don't say chocolate.
Oh man, gee, no, definitely not. A vintage champagne is always good, and I demand when I teach people how to do a back kickover. That's the only payment I ever ask for. Is vintage champagne. So yeah, that's my inspiration.
That's
guilty
a first.
pleasure.
Yeah. That was your inspiration. Bloody hell. Okay.
No. Inspiration. Inspiration is. The things that inspire me, I really like working with other people. And that's certainly something that the pandemic has shown, is that, man, I like working alone. Working alone's cool. That's great. But I really find it very inspiring to work with other people. That takes me off, sets my mind racing, and I get excited by it. I dig working with people when they churn up ideas and nobody's hung up about whether something's good or not, where there's just a real exploration, but exploration amongst people who then wish to polish and improve upon it and refine. That I find really exciting.
Thank you, Edward, for coming on.